Hey everyone, so let's talk about the always important topic of caching. In this case, specifically about Vellum caching. What I have here is a little, medieval stand and some cloth I want to let fall down on it. So then it looks like this. And as you can see, that takes a while to simulate. And let's say we don't want to do this every single time we open the file. We just want to do this once, so we cache it out, of course. Now, what we've already learned is that you can use the file cache for that, and you can just use that node because it has a read and write and even an automatic mode. So you can directly read it out from it if you want. The naming I would always recommend is hipname as a subfolder and then $OS for operator string, which is just the name of the node. So let's call this stand cloth, something like that. And then this will make sense later on when you cache it out. And as you know, I prefer to read and write in separate nodes. So I would write it with a file cache and then read it in with a file node because I find it clearer and less error prone to do it this way. This works, but of course now we have a problem because what we don't get, and this is a special case that is new, we have constraints now. And of course what we could do is we could save multiple caches, but that gets out of hand really quickly. So what can you do here? Well, for this problem, there's actually a system that came from side effects to make it easier to cache multiple streams in a more complex setup like this. And this is called Vellum pack, Vellum unpack, and then there's a third node called Vellum IO, which basically does the same. So as you can see, the Vellum pack has multiple inputs, and what you can do here is you can kind of combine two streams, which is meant for the geometry and the constraints. You can then cache that with a file cache. Like this. And if we quickly simulate this, so now that this is done, I can take the absolute path from my cache and read it in with a file node and just make sure that you replace the frame with the $F so that it reads out the whole sequence. And then this is a bit misleading because we only see the geometry right now. But if we use, of course, a Vellum unpack, we can now split the information into the geometry on one side and the constraints on the other, and you can see both is saved. So this is basically my workflow that I usually do, but in this case, constraints and the geometry. But there's an alternative to that, and that is what we've already talked about, the Vellum IO. And the Vellum IO has basically all of this built in. So it has the geometry, it has the constraints, but on top it has the collision geometry that you can also save. And this is basically a file cache in itself. So you can define a path here. So let's make this a bit nicer with my usual setup of hip name, node name, and then the name of the cache. And if I cache this out, I can now switch this to read files, and of course I can now read from disk the geometry and also the constraints. And what's new is I can also save the geometry for the collision geometry, and now I can basically merge all of this together in one and have not only my simulation but also the underlying collision geometry in one. Now it's up to you if you prefer that. As I said before, I prefer an air gap and also an absolute path, because otherwise you have the problem of this path changing with every change in your setup. And let me quickly show you what I mean by that. As soon as I've changed my hip name, so if I change my file under a different name, all of a sudden my caches are breaking, which I find an absurd thing. Whereas my other setup will always work no matter what the hip name is. And even what the name of the node is, it will always be correct because this is an absolute path. So I'm not a big fan of that in terms of usability. So I would always use the right approach here and just save out my collision geometry separately, which is not a big deal. I can just afterwards merge it with the rest. It's not really a massive disadvantage in my experience. But if you prefer the left side, it's up to you. Okay, so those are two ways of caching Vellum. I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.